Our slab had snow on it yesterday, barely evaporated off the top where the concrete looks dry, but as you can see, as soon as you cut down into it, this is very common, you see less than 1/8 of an inch under the surface down on the fracture. It's very wet and there's pooling moisture coming out. So there's actually mud right where we actually cut our cut. So now it just comes down to science. So we're gonna be using 99% isopropyl alcohol to draw the actual moisture out of this slab, because alcohol actually adsorbs moisture to itself. It won't just mix with moisture, it actually adsorbs and will draw moisture from a slab. So it's really important to use alcohol and not acetone or something that's just water soluble, because we're actually going to use acetone in our fracture patch that we're going to mix, and it's the same epoxy, our outdoor flex, that we're going to pour on the whole slab anyways, but we pour it into our actual fracture here and mix with 20% acetone after we draw the moisture out that we can, because if there's any residual moisture left in the fracture after we do this, the acetone will actually help the epoxy bond with that moisture and cure into it on a molecular level. So it'll actually work much better than most vapor barriers. So we're starting out here because there's a lot of moisture down in our slab, and cutting into our fractures, opening up our fractures with a V-notch blade, definitely exposed a lot of that moisture, which is good. We're just spraying alcohol down into the fracture, and you may or may not want to torch it off later. Just remember, a torch, you want to be away from anything. You're going to have an open flame. It's going to be very small and controllable, but I try to kind of recommend against that, just because obviously you have to manage that. So, but definitely you can torch it afterwards. Just make sure all your alcohol has evaporated. So I'm going to go ahead and spray this down here, and I'm only spraying this because I know my actual mix, my outdoor flex, is already mixed for us to bind this fracture up. I wouldn't want to let there be an hour in between. I want to do it immediately after. All I'm looking to do is pour enough of this into the fracture, into that V-notch joint, that it's going to bond to both sides of my fracture. And if I mess up or I get it anywhere else, I'll just put it where I want to with my chip brush. A lot of times I'll let this settle in here, and I'll just kind of manage my pour. I'll make sure it goes about 1 inch out from my fracture. I'm wanting to bind into both sides of my joint because I want to allow future movement without allowing a fracture in the actual concrete. Crack chasing is one thing. I like to keep a few small. These are like 4-inch grinders. You can put 4.5-inch heads on them, whatever. But usually you're only using these to get into a corner or somewhere where you couldn't have accessed with either a walk behind or your 7-inch, like a larger Metabo or something like this. So I like to be able to run my big flats with a walk behind if you don't have a lot of vertical separation, a lot of fractures where you've settled, because if you ever have a fracture in your concrete where one side settles down and you run a puck on a big walk behind off that, you'll catch that puck. So a lot of times guys try to get big walk behind grinders because they think it's a professional thing to do. None of their freaking jobs would have actually been accessible to a walk behind, or it could have been, but they would have been, half their work would have been trying to make sure that walk behind could be used. So you'd be really surprised what a really aggressive Metabo 7-inch, and if you are running a 7-inch, I don't personally believe there's anything next to Metabo. Metabo I don't think makes good tools in some of their bigger stuff, but their concrete grinding grinder right here, I think it's the king of, and everybody that's ever used it has said the same thing. So that's my thought. Now they do make a lower end Metabo setup too, but this one, it costs about $700, so get the better one. Yeah, it's worth it though. And then you run it right to your dust control system. I like this. This is how you got your cast cut off. It's probably what kept you company through grade school. I don't know. I'm just kidding. But really awesome for getting. Really awesome to get into corners. Cut anything. It's just a grout tool remover, a grout removal tool. But you can also get into a lot of odd spots like this, and that's a diamond attachment on there where you couldn't have. I mean. So basically, what I believe to do all your prep, you need to be able to run all your edges first, get all your corners, get them opened up enough so your 7-inch can get in them. Then if you have a bunch of little fractures, all these were used to be as little tiny fractures. The problem with a little fracture is moisture gets down in it. And if you were to and then moisture freezes, and moisture expands when it freezes, so it'll push the slab apart. Whereas if you actually open this up with a crack chasing wheel like that, it's a V-notch wheel like this, it goes in that tiny little fracture and cuts it open a little bit wider in the top. And what that mainly does is it creates a funnel so that you pour a flexible epoxy. And if you guys feel this, feel how flexible that is still. That was our outdoor flex. And how is Philip around? How hot was it when we poured this? 20, 23, 20, 25 degrees, something like that?
It was about 20.
And we ground this and poured this all outside in freezing weather. And you notice it cured just fine, but it's flexible. But now you also, not only did it leave a funnel to actually channel a lot more epoxy down into that fracture and block that moisture, but now you have a little bit of a span, almost a bridge, that allows a lot of flex. So now if that fracture does move, it allows a flexible epoxy to bow, and it gives it some stretch and some flex and basically elongation on that surface. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's why if you were to leave your fracture really tight on the top, you'd still see it pop through the next year. It's only because it's not giving it enough room for it to flex, whereas now that's plenty of room. So basically, I would run my 7-inch. If you notice this, the 2 pores here, this slab and that slab where the expansion joint is, I can see it's high on this side of this slab, and then it kicks up on the other side. So you'd want to be running all that with your 7-inch grinder, if that makes sense. So
just to smooth that to get it even.
Yep. So tomorrow we are going to run all these tools and get some practice. I just wanted you guys to see going into corners, fractures, not quite as tight at corners, anything with really uneven surfaces and whatnot, I'll run my 7-inch on. Yeah, even like a busted up driveway or garage. Think about how many garages I've seen, a small garage, and a crew's running out there for $2,500, $3,500 to coat it. By the time if a guy can jump out with one of these on a small vac and just start grinding the damn garage floor, he's probably going to be faster than the guy that drops the trailer, drops the ramp, hooks up his generator, hooks up his grinder to it, hooks up his generator, hooks up his vac to that. I mean, because a lot of them, even small grinders, medium grinders, can't run off of a wall outlet that easy. So by the time you set all this stuff up, sometimes this guy's off the job site already.
So what's the main purpose of this besides leveling?
Profiling. You're cutting highs. So I believe in this. You grind your highs, you fill your lows, you seal your slab. So I'm always grinding highs, filling lows, and sealing my slab. That's my rule. That's how you always want a profiled slab. That is prep. If you're prep, if you're looking, you're like, man, am I ready to pour epoxy? And you see a high spot, no, you're not. If you see a low spot that's not filled, no, you're not. So if your slab's not sealed, no, you're not. So grind my highs, fill my lows, seal my slab.
What you're standing on is ready to coat?
No, not sealed.
Okay.
Now, for aggregate coatings, there's a few rules. Interior stuff, absolutely not. Since aggregates can broadcast through, sometimes we will broadcast into our first coat. I know that it'll be more even and uniform if you don't. So, but even my seal coats, I still lightly broadcast into them a tiny bit. So, awesome.
So on the interior of the fractures, do you have to open them up too, even if it's no moisture?
I would always do it just so you guaranteed enough epoxy got down in there. I open up every fracture.
Okay.
However, you're not going to have the extreme thermal expansion and contraction, so you might not have as much damage happening due to heat and cold later. But just to channel that epoxy into it, I would. Okay. Just because I've never seen a fracture fail when it was treated right in the first place. And I've skimped on some, and I get.
What about just regular cracks?
Any fracture needs filled. So okay. All fractures. So a crack is a crack. Now an expansion joint, deal with it and depend on whether you want to honor that expansion joint and let it keep moving. But if it's a crack or a fracture or anything that happened because you don't want it there and you want to stop that, you need to open up the top, fill it. Now if it's too much movement, we'll have other ways, and I'll show you on the board. Like say it's a really open, there's a lot of horizontal expansion and stuff, then I have other ways to deal with that. And then there's some ways I'll draw on the board, but I wanted you guys to understand the tooling before we went over that. But do about 5 or 7 to 1. I usually run 10% is about as dry as you want to mix this, and this is kind of important. You know how your kids play with kinetic sand? Yeah. It's real dry, almost doesn't even stick to your hands. So that's about probably at 10% epoxy to sand by volume. And only this quartz and I don't know that you can do the system with other sizes of sand, but realize this is a really gauged, similar size sand. So it flows a little differently when you get like playground sand and stuff like that. Sometimes it'll be creamy and it'll keep flowing on you, it won't stack. And that's just because of the science of the actual particle of the sand. So I'm not trying to sell you sand or anything, I'm just explaining that I've done this with other products and couldn't figure out why it wouldn't work. So, and like say you mix epoxy at 10% epoxy to gypsum powder, like the 20-minute mud, that powder, that you wouldn't even be able to mix it. You'd need 50% because that's such a fine particle. So this bigger particle allows you to go down to about 10%, but it really flows better at about 15-20%. So we can mix 8 to 10 quarts of sand. We can fill this bucket 8 to 10 quarts of sand in here and still be just fine. So if somebody wants to help me there and just dump some sand in while I mix, This sand's gonna be awesome. You could dry pack a shower pan with it, you could do anything with it, and we're gonna do some stuff outside. And you notice I already mixed my epoxy before I did this. You wouldn't want to try to mix your A and B and sand because you'd never get a good mix.
More?
Oh yeah, we're gonna fill the bucket almost up. Or to whatever consistency we like. You got a cup maybe up there or something. And I literally didn't know what to do, so I made like a mix station right there on the ground like this. Sometimes if the crack's wide enough, you can actually pack it in. So there's one, and I would never be afraid of that ever failing.